Well, hello everyone. I wanted to turn around and start making some lectures and basically include them as part of the material for any given week. And so now that we're into the chapter on perception, I thought now would be a good time because I have some good material that I would like to cover dealing with this chapter. Now, your chapter actually is referred to as perception, or I call it consumer perception. But to be honest with you, I've sort of expanded it because really the chapter is all about sensation and perception. And so as we get into this chapter, really we start off talking not about perception initially, but we actually talk about sensation. You see, it all begins with sensing things, all right? Because that's what sensation is. Sensation is a process. It's the process of detecting things or sensing things, picking up things in our environment, okay? And when it comes to businesses and consumerism, trying to get customers to notice things is very, very important. So, in consumer terms, what we're talking about when we talk about the ability to detect stimuli, it actually can mean the difference between a customer that notices you and your product and a customer that doesn't. So sensation is very, very important. We want customers to be able to notice what it is that we are offering. So very, very important that we do that. Okay. So know this: sensation is a process. Perception is also a process. Perception is really the process of organizing what it is that we have sensed. I'll say that again. Perception is the process of organizing that which we have sensed. But first, we've got to sense it. Okay, so let me continue to talk about sensation here. All right, what are we talking about? Sights. You know, we see color, we see things that contrast, they catch our eye. Um, Sounds, we'll talk about some of the different types of sounds, from what your cell phone makes to basically how ads are designed and how companies try to get you to pay attention through what you hear. Smells. I mean, obviously that's a very big one. Some companies, depending on the products they sell, it's all about how the product smells or tastes. From food to wines to soda and so on, and even touch. So these are the five senses that really come into play. We first, to sense stimuli, these are really the first things that have to happen. We have to be able to sense things. So once we've done that, we are then able to use perception. Once we've sensed something, then we can use the perceptual process to determine what we like versus what we don't like. Okay? That's very important. We have to decide what we're going to pay attention to and what we're not going to pay attention to. In this chapter, we talk about the three stages of perception. And we're going to sort of go over these. We're going to talk about attention, a bit of exposure, that's the sensation part, and then understanding what it is that we've picked up. But you need to know these three categories. Exposure, that, as I just said, is all about being able to pick up on things. We're going to talk about what's called perception by exception, intensity, and so on as ways to get us to notice. Attention, uh, what contrasts the norm, so to speak, gets us to pay attention, and then our ability to interpret what it is that we're perceiving. That's what the three stages of perception are all about. So let's get started into more detail in some of this. First of all, the study of sensation or sensory thresholds has a technical name. We call it psychophysics. In my intro psych class, I tell students that psychophysics is the study of sensation and perception. And if you really want to wow your family, what you do is this. When they ask you what you're studying at OTC, you turn around and tell them, once you get to this chapter on sensation perception, that you're studying Psychophysics. Man, does that sound impressive. It really, truly does. Psychophysics studies thresholds. And there's two terms you need to know. One is called an absolute threshold. An absolute threshold is the point at which you begin to detect a stimulus, a sight, a sound, a smell, a taste, a touch, whatever. The point at which you begin to detect a stimulus, all right? Now, absolute, the term absolute is something of a misnomer because that means that if you always pick up a sound or if you initially pick up a sound at a certain decibel range, you'll always pick it up at that level. That's not true. Sometimes you're not paying as much attention. Sometimes you're paying extra attention. So it varies. The definition of an absolute threshold is the point at which you detect a stimulus 50% of the time. If about half the time you pick it up at a certain level, that is your absolute threshold. A difference threshold is another term you need to know in psychophysics, and that is the point at which you can notice a change, a difference in thresholds. Maybe the intensity of a light is greater or it's not as great. A sound is louder or not as loud. The minimum amount of change necessary to notice a difference. That's the definition of a difference threshold. And it helps to know these two. Absolute thresholds and difference thresholds. When it comes to consumer products and you're trying to make changes, I'll give you a little bit of advice. Studies find that if you're going to change your product, you don't want to make mad, dramatic changes. A lot of times that upsets customers. Changes work best if they're made slowly. To give you an example, Coke and Pepsi. This is the original Pepsi can there on the right that was in red, white, and blue for so many decades, all right? Sometimes people would confuse it depending upon where it sat in relation to Coke, which was pretty much all red and white, no blue. And people would accidentally pick up Coca-Cola instead of picking up Pepsi-Cola. Well, the company went ahead and made a dramatic change. They went from a red can to a blue can. And it was such an over-the-top change so quickly that, believe it or not, some people didn't like it. In fact, it didn't necessarily go over well. So it's something to take into consideration, a little extra that you definitely need to know. Okay, folks, that's enough for this moment. I wanted to turn around and break the ice with some definitions and some explanations of thresholds. Remember, with these videos, you can turn around and stop them, write down notes, move them back, listen to the video lecture a little bit more, and continue on. Thanks for taking part. Thanks for joining me.